I've got a beer, I've got a kitten. That can mean only one thing. I got some new glasses. Woo! Halfway through filming this. So the continuity is just terrible, but I don't look like the slug secretary lady from Monsters Inc. anymore. So today's episode is a lot of information. It required a lot of research and a lot of beer, but we did it. I think it is something that is really important, and it's something I'm quite passionate about. The issues surrounding objects in European museums. The ethics of how they got there. The question of whether they should be returned. It's a pretty controversial debate. I have an opinion, but I really don't want to impose that on anyone else. I want to just provide a little bit of information and background on some certain objects so that people can make their own decisions. I also just think that when we go to museums, it really adds so much more to the experience to understand the parts of the object's history that you're not made aware of on the little plaque thingies. The history of how an object got into a museum and the reason that it's there is as much its history as what happened to it before it was taken. It may not always be comfortable, but history isn't comfortable. So yeah, this is just to kind of give a bit more of an idea, maybe. Yeah, enjoy. The British Museum was established in 1753. And its permanent collection currently stands at over 8 million objects. The British Museum aims to document human culture from its beginning to the present, and it was the first public national museum in the world. Many of the objects belonging to the British Museum were sourced during the era of the British Empire. This has meant that in recent years, there's been a lot of controversy over who the rightful owners of these objects are. And that is what we're going to be talking about today. So the first object that I'm going to talk about is probably one of the most well-recognised objects belonging to the British Museum. It's a 2.5 metre tall statue known as Hoa Hakananaya. Hoa Hakananaya comes from the island Rapa Nui. Rapa Nui is the indigenous name for what we would more commonly know as Easter Island. The reason that it's called Easter Island is because that was the name given to the island by its first European discoverer, a Dutch explorer named Jacob Roggeveen. Jacob Roggeveen first visited the island in 1722 on Easter Sunday, hence its name. How original. Rapa Nui is located in the southeast of the Pacific Ocean and is a special territory belonging to Chile. Hoa Hakananaya is one of 900 statues of its type, which are known as Moai statues. Moai statues were carved by Rapa Nui islanders between the years 1100 and 1600 AD. Hoa Hakananaya was taken by a man named Richard Powell in 1869. Richard Powell was the captain of a Royal Navy ship named HMS Topaz, which sailed for Rapa Nui in 1868. Powell and his crew discovered Hoa Hakananaya in a village in the southwest of Rapa Nui. Without permission, Hoa Hakananaya was dug out and rafted down to the ship, where it sailed back to the UK and arrived in Plymouth in 1869. There, Powell gifted the statue to Queen Victoria, who decided that it would be best displayed at the British Museum, where it has remained ever since. Rapa Nui Islanders believed that they should have Hoa Hakananaya back. But this isn't just because he was taken without consent. It's because, to the islanders of Rapa Nui, the Moai statues contain the living spirits of their ancestors. When eyes are carved onto the statues, it is believed that life is breathed into them, and they become the living embodiment of prominent tribal leaders and ancestors whose role is to protect the islanders. This means that to the people of Rapa Nui, the British Museum currently have the living spirit of their ancestors on display. In 2018, a delegation from the island Rapa Nui travelled to the UK to engage in talks with the British Museum in the hope that Hoa Hakananaya could be returned to the island. A spokesperson from the British Museum responded to these requests to return Hoa Hakananaya with, "Hoa Hakananaya is free to view in our Welcome Trust gallery. We believe that there is great value in presenting objects from across the world alongside the stories of other cultures here at the British Museum." Like I said, I want to provide both sides to the argument of whether or not these objects should return, and I definitely understand this. There are a lot of people on the other side who wouldn't be able to travel to see these amazing things and to learn about these cultures. And so to be able to freely access them at the British Museum is hugely, hugely important and incredible. And we are really, really lucky. But I guess the point just always stands that if these objects aren't ours, then how much of a right do we have to go and access them freely when the people that they belong to can't have that same privilege? Another point is that this isn't just one statue on its own. This is one of 900. So Surely the British Museum can just keep one because it means that thousands more people are learning about these objects. So something that's been put forward by the Rapa Nui people is that they want to swap Hoa Hakananaya for an exact replica that would be carved by a skilled islander. Not only would this mean that the Rapa Nui people would have their spiritual ancestor back, but it would also help to serve the purpose of museums as educational resources. Because yes, you might not have the original, but if you have an information plaque explaining why you don't have the original, then surely you're teaching people more. And also, surely it makes the museum look good. When seeing Hoa Hakananaya for the first time, the governor of Chile explained how she believed her children and her children's children deserved the same opportunity to be able to touch, see, and learn from Hoa Hakananaya. She told reporters, "We are just a body. You, the British people, have our soul." So yeah, that's a little bit about Hoa Hakananaya. Next, we're going to take a trip. Well, no, we're not. The whole point of this is we're going to stay at the British Museum. But we're going to take a trip, kind of, to Africa and talk about the Benin Bronzes. The Benin Bronzes is the name given to the collection of art that once belonged to the ancient kingdom of Benin, which is now in today's southern Nigeria. They were created from the 13th century onwards and made to decorate the Oba, or ruler's palace, and the large courtyard. Okay. Delilah had just fallen down the stairs and then got trapped in a shoe, so she'll be staying with me until she calms down a bit. The main theme of the artwork was to glorify the Oba's power and tell the history of the Benin Empire. There are believed to be around 3,000 Benin Bronzes scattered all over the world. The British Museum holds one of the largest collections of Benin Bronzes, with over 700 objects in its permanent collection. So how did these bronzes end up in the British Museum? Towards the end of the 19th century, tensions between Britain and Benin were high. This was due to disputes regarding trading and the Oba's reluctancy to adhere to deals put forward by the British Empire. On the 2nd of January 1897, a British official named James Phillips travelled to Benin with the intention of stopping the Oba from interrupting British trade. While British officials had given word of their intended visit, they were later told they would need to postpone, as their chosen time clashed with an important religious festival that was taking place in Benin. Despite the fact they were told that foreigners were forbidden from entering the city while certain rituals were taking place, they ignored this and went ahead with their visit. The British delegation were ambushed by a group from the city that by all known accounts were acting without the knowledge of the Oba. Almost the entire group were killed, including Phillips. News of what was called the Benin Massacre quickly spread back to England, and outrage ensued. On February the 18th, the British Army seized Benin. The expedition, led by Admiral Harry Rawson, sacked and totally destroyed Benin. As well as sending the Oba into exile, British soldiers saw the siege as an opportunity to loot the city of all of its treasures. British officer Captain Herbert Sutherland Walker wrote in his diary that the British soldiers were wandering around with a chisel and hammer, knocking off brass figures and collecting all sorts of rubbish as loot. All the stuff of any value found in the King's Palace and surrounding houses had been collected. Within months, much of the bounty had made its way to England, where it was either sold at auctions, kept as souvenirs, or given to museums. Since Nigeria gained independence from Britain in 1960, there have been multiple calls for the bronzes to be returned. In 2018, it was agreed that within 3 years, some of the collection's most iconic pieces would be returned to Nigeria. However, this will only be on a temporary basis. The objects will be loaned to Nigeria, but will remain still under the permanent collection belonging to the British Museum. Crusoe Asagi, aide to the governor of the Edo State of Nigeria, has said that it is hoped that these are only the first steps. He believes that the British Museum have stolen property, and if you have stolen property, you need to give it back. So some of the counter-arguments against permanently returning the Benin Bronzes are grounded in the fact that many people believe they act as ambassadors, representing the talents and cultures of the Edo people. Certainly, when the Benin Bronzes were first put on display in the British Museum, they dramatically challenged Western presumptions of African primitivism. Their very existence opposed the dominant belief of the 19th century that African people lacked the understanding to produce art. Seeing these pieces stood in front of them, European people were forced to question their understandings of race, and the spread of Benin art across Europe led to a much greater reception and appreciation of African art and culture. So finally, I have left the most controversial and most heated debate. We are heading to Greece to talk about the Parthenon Marbles. So the Parthenon Marbles are the name given to a collection of ancient Greek art which were once part of the Parthenon, a temple located in Athens, Greece, dedicated to the goddess of wisdom, Athena. The temple was decorated with sculptures made by the ancient artist known as Phidias and were completed in 432 BC, so around 2,500 years ago. The Parthenon was one of the most important buildings to the ancient Greeks, and the sculptures inside of it are considered some of the highest points of classical art. Today, the Parthenon marbles can be found divided mostly between Athens and London, with a considerable amount having been on display in the British Museum since 1817. The Parthenon marbles that are on display in the British Museum are also known as the Elgin marbles, named after Lord Elgin, who was responsible for their removal and transportation to London. The Elgin marble debate is probably the most famous and the most heated debate over whether or not objects from the British Museum should be returned. So, how did these objects end up in the British Museum? From 1456, Greece came under the rule of the Ottoman Empire, and the Parthenon was transformed into a mosque. The temple remained a mosque until 1687, during what is known as the Marian War, fought between the Republic of Venice and the Ottoman Empire. The Venetians led an attack to capture Athens, and for a reason I don't really get, the Ottomans used the Parthenon to store gunpowder. And so it's unsurprising that when it was hit, it exploded, and a lot of the temple was destroyed. After the war, the ruins of the Parthenon remained under Ottoman ownership and were still considered hugely significant. So fast forward to 1801 and we meet the British ambassador to the Ottomans, a man who had many names, but for the purpose of this video was called Lord Elgin. So Lord Elgin was a huge admirer of classical Greek art, and whilst he was on a diplomatic trip to visit the Ottomans, he wanted to send a crew to Athens to survey and sketch the Parthenon in the hope of bringing their findings home and recreating classical art in England. So this is where it starts to get contested. Because of the cultural significance of the Parthenon, Lord Elgin was told that he would require permission from the Ottoman ruler, or Sultan, Selim III. Elgin is claimed to have received this letter, which, according to him, not only gave the men permission to replicate casts of any sculptures they wanted, but also to remove any parts of the Parthenon that they wanted to take home with them. The team proceeded to dismantle large parts of the temple, and in 1803, the collection was gathered, packed up, and shipped to England. The British government purchased the marbles from Lord Elgin in 1816. They have been housed at the British Museum ever since. Greece gained independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1832. I'm getting so into this, all I can hear is my earrings, so I'm going to take them off. From the 1980s onwards is really where the Greek petition for the return of the objects properly takes off. So, the big debate is, did Lord Elgin really receive permission from the Ottoman Sultan? Annoyingly, we kind of don't know. But historians and antique experts who have examined the available evidence, have claimed Lord Elgin and his crew acted without the permission of the Sultan. The letter that was supposedly given to Elgin no longer exists. What the museum does have in its archive is a later letter that was translated into Italian from an Ottoman general, which does authorise Lord Elgin and his men to enter the Parthenon. It explicitly gives permission for plaster casts to be made. However, there is no direct mention of any permission to remove parts of the Parthenon. I was going to kind of include a breakdown of the letter, but honestly, it's really confusing. But if you do want to read into it, I thought it would be better just to include a paragraph explaining it. But basically, there is no definitive proof that Lord Elgin was granted explicit permission. Now, if Lord Elgin did take these objects without the permission of the Sultan, this defies the British Museum's claim that there was an Ottoman permit allowing for these objects to be taken. This would mean that the British Museum's current possession of the objects has no legal standing. Now, I did a little investigating to see how much the British Museum acknowledges the controversial backstory of the Parthenon marbles, and they do make note of it. And there is a webpage that you can go on which states that it provides key information in understanding the complex history of the Parthenon marbles. However, when explaining the history of how they ended up in London, the webpage states that Lord Elgin acted with the full knowledge and permission of the Ottoman authorities. Now, maybe he did, but there are a lot of people and governments that say he didn't. And considering the original letter from the Sultan no longer exists, the British Museum kind of don't have any definitive proof to back up the statement. So For decades, one of the main arguments against the return of the Parthenon marbles to Athens was that Greece didn't have anywhere to display and look after them. But in 2009, the Acropolis Museum of Athens opened, and it included a specific gallery to permanently display all of the Parthenon marbles. So the Elgin marble debate is even more scandalous because the British Museum have said that they're willing to loan the new museum the Parthenon marbles as long as Greek authorities agree to recognise that their permanent ownership lies with the British Museum, something that Greece refuses to do. The current director of the British Museum continues to uphold the view that the British Museum are the legal and rightful owners of the Parthenon marbles. And so the debate continues. So these are 3 examples, probably the most famous or well-publicised examples of the British Museum debate. But across Europe, there are hundreds, thousands of less well-known objects that also have a similar kind of debate surrounding them. So it's really hard to kind of apply one answer because each example is so different. One thing I will say is that this idea that we should just empty the museum of all of the objects that do not belong to us, I think is not the way to go about it. We shouldn't be assuming that every country, every indigenous group wants these objects back. There are examples where people have said, keep them. We like them being there. Yeah, that is just something I wanted to add on to the end of it. This isn't about emptying the museum. It's about understanding what the conversation is behind these objects and just learning more about them. Yeah. Hope you learned stuff. If you have thoughts on this, you can drop a comment. Yeah, cool, nice. Bye.